of the people in Jerusalem becomes associated with this group. They control the temple, but they're also very much compromisers with the Romans. They come out of the Hasmonean rulers of the time of the Maccabees, and they have a less Jewish sense of identity. They're willing to compromise. Like, why can't we just get along? In some ways, again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You can take it too far and it becomes problematic. But in the beginning, it was probably like, well, we could use some Greek names for different things. We could build our houses in Greek style. Like, Greek modes of dress probably aren't the end of the world. So they're trying to find places and ways where they can compromise, at first with the Greek rulers and then with the Romans. But ultimately, it becomes political and very corrupt and taken too far. The Romans kind of pay them off, so they support the Romans, but they're not actually preserving what needs to be preserved, Jewish identity. Jesus rejects their theology. He says no. He says about them, like, you know nothing about the scriptures and nothing about God. The Zealots are the third group. They use force and armed resistance to overthrow the Romans. This would now be called terrorism. They have a similar zeal to the Pharisees. They're very concerned about the people and the nation and national identity. But for the Zealots, the solution to national identity isn't religious fervor, it's military violence. And so they attack the Romans. The Essenes seem to arise at the same time as the Sadducees and the Hasmoneans, so the revolt against the Seleucid rulers that we talked about earlier. When the temple priesthood gets corrupt, the Essenes move out into the desert, probably led by some priests and Levites from the temple, but they reject the temple. The temple has become corrupt. It's no longer doing what it is supposed to. It's compromised politically. It's making a mess of things. We're out here as a holy people to prepare the way for the Lord. John the Baptist seems to have been associated with the Essene community. They lived out on the shores of the Dead Sea, where John spent a significant amount of time. They also had centers in Jerusalem and in Galilee. It's very, very possible that families like Joseph and Mary and Zechariah and Elizabeth had at least some contact with the Essenes, if not have some outright association with them. They're very similar to Christianity in many ways. They practice a lot of water rituals that are very similar to Christian baptism, not with the same mentality of it, but St. John the Baptist, baptism of repentance, probably comes from the Essenes, or at least is connected to their ritual. These are the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they end up ceasing to exist in about 70 AD. When the Romans destroyed the temple, the Sadducees are all killed, so they're gone. The Zealots are all killed, so they're gone. The Essenes seem to have been either wiped out by the Romans, or they do seem to kind of just disappear from history. I think the strong possibility is that many, if not most of them, became Christians, because Christian theology and Jesus are so similar to some of the things that they were teaching and that they believed. But they seem to have come to an end around 70 AD as well, which leaves only the Pharisees as a Jewish group after the life of Jesus, and so the Pharisees become the originators of all of modern-day Judaism. It all develops from the Pharisees. This is a time in the world as you transition from exile to Greek rule to Roman rule, where Alexandria rises in importance significantly. This was a city built on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt after the time of Alexander the Great, so the Greek ruler who conquered the Holy Land. It was the capital of the Ptolemies in Egypt. It was probably the largest city in the ancient world. It likely had 1 million people or more. There was a huge Jewish community there. It was a place of learning and study. The Ptolemies decide that they want to have a copy of all the books in the world. They start building the great library at Alexandria and copying texts from all of these foreign places. It's a place of Greek philosophy, so Alexandria becomes kind of the refuge of the Athenians, the Greek philosophers, the followers of Plato, followers of Aristotle, and through them, And because of this Jewish community there, Judaism and the Old Testament also encounter Greek philosophy. This leads to the development of an entire group of the scriptures called the wisdom literature, the book of Proverbs, the book of wisdom. Many of those works date from this time between the Greek conquest in 323 and the life of Jesus, which probably begins in about 4 BC. So Judaism and the scriptures are reread in the light of Jewish philosophy. One of the themes that develops is the association of the Messiah in the scriptures with wisdom. That comes from Greek philosophy and this Neoplatonic school in Alexandria. There's some great Jewish scholars there. This is the place where the Septuagint is written. So that's a translation of the Jewish Bible. They collect all of these different books that were written in Hebrew, and they translate them. Traditionally, it's done by 70 scholars. That's where Septuagint comes from. It means like the book of the 70. And they make this translation there. That translation becomes critically important. First of all, because it's a translation that's used by the New Testament and by Jesus when he's quoting the scriptures. They quote the Septuagint. They don't quote the Hebrew. They quote this Greek version. And the New Testament is ultimately written in Greek, this language that was widely spoken by Jews and even widely spoken in Israel by the time of Jesus. This Jewish translation, the Septuagint, becomes widely known outside of Israel. And one of the fascinating things is the oldest copies of the scriptures that we have are copies of the Septuagint. So this work that is done probably around 150 BC. At this time, there's not a settled canon of the scriptures, and so the Septuagint includes more books than we have Hebrew originals for. The Pharisees ultimately reject some of those Greek works, and this is why there's a difference in the number of biblical books between Catholics and Protestants. This time period is called Second Temple Judaism, after they rebuild the temple. There's no more Ark of the Covenant. It's not as pretty as the Temple of Solomon, at least until the reconstruction that is completed by Herod the Great, and takes something like 40 years. We have road construction now. They had more, and it took longer because they were building with rocks. The people start to look for the coming of the Messiah. Somehow this rule by the Greeks and then the Romans doesn't feel like what God has promised. It doesn't feel like this is the way that life should be. And so they start to cry out for the Lord to help them. Ultimately, God says that they're still in exile, that the exile isn't just 70 years, but 490 years, 70 weeks of years. And so if you look at 490 years from the time of the exile, you get to shortly before the time of Jesus. And that's part of where the messianic fervor of that time comes from. The people were longing for freedom from the Romans. They wanted to be out of Roman taxation. It's important to remember that even though Israel is so important for Christianity and Judaism, in the grand scheme of people in the world, there's actually not that many people that live there, and it's not very much on the map. It's a Roman province. It's like out in the middle of nowhere. It's a little bit like being from North Dakota. It's not highly thought of. Roman rule is relatively unstable. There's Jewish revolts. The people are fighting. The Romans do some stupid things. They could be arrogant. Pontius Pilate is certainly that way. He's appointed by the Senate. He's always in a love-hate relationship with Judaism. More like a hate or can get along begrudgingly. Maybe not so much love. But, the Romans do things like they massacre hundreds of Pharisees and they crucify them outside of Jerusalem. That was something that was still in the consciousness of the people at the time of Jesus, that the Romans had done that some time before. Crucifixion was something that wasn't only done to Jesus. The Romans became rather fond of it as a way to demoralize and destroy resistance to them. At the time, temple ritual and liturgy kind of governed the life of the people. There's many sacrifices each day. There's some particular times. They have particular times that they pray. They offer incense in the temple. There's an altar of incense. That's something that Christianity will pick up on. They begin to recite the Psalms and have different choirs. These seem to have been started in the time of David, but they persevered, and so they're sort of resurrected, particularly during the Hasmonean time and this rejection of Greek rule. And then into the time of the Romans, the Levites become important for that. Some of them were singers. The people would gather and pray. They have the synagogues. The temple also becomes a place of learning. Important rabbis gather there. They would teach their students. There's other rabbis in the time that were very important. We have some of their teachings preserved today in a big document called the Talmud. That's the teaching of the rabbis. There's a Babylonian Talmud and a Jerusalem Talmud. These are the collection that are later put together by the Pharisees because they survived the Roman occupation. And they have many rabbis that lived at the time of Jesus. Hillel and Shammai are two of the most important ones. We don't really have time to talk about them all, so we're going to skip them. The temple is the dwelling place of God on earth and the heart of Jewish life. It's governed by Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, these feasts. It's governed by the agricultural year. There's this uneasy tension with the Romans. The people are longing for a Messiah. Some of them are very faithful, and they're striving to live in communion with God. They're following the best parts of the movement of the Pharisees. John the Baptist and this group of the Essenes in the desert are out preparing the way for the Lord. And this brings us right up to the time of Jesus. I know this probably feels like a whirlwind. I wish I could be there to answer all your questions. You'll find some questions for your own discussion at the end of this section of notes, and I hope to hear from you. If you have questions, feel free to email me or respond to one of the Flocknote messages. I get those as well. And then we'll pick up with the life of Jesus and the life of the church, the first chapter of our book, when we resume in a few weeks. God bless you.